Hello everyone. One thing I love is a great deal, and I found this HP Pavilion 6535 at an auction. Let's get it cleaned up and test it out. Here's a better look at the case. You can still see some scuffs along the back where it was tossed around at the auction. Unfortunately, since this case is proprietary, I have to use this HP power supply. Luckily, it's a standard 20-pin layout, so I was able to test the computer after I cleaned it. The motherboard here is very standard for the era. It just requires me to use PS2 connectors instead of USB before Windows can boot. The processor in this unit is the Intel Celeron. It's running at 466 MHz. I like how these old processors had their information printed on the bottom instead of the top. This PC is going to use 64 megabytes of PC100 RAM. I've also added a network card. This system can't use USB storage without some updates. I have the files on the network. The computer did have a modem installed originally, but I'm not going to use it in the rebuild. This computer uses IDE for its storage. I have a 200 gig Maxter IDE hard drive, and when you look at the jumpers and the IDE connector, you can see I have this one set to master and the capacity limited to 32 gigs. I'm going to take that jumper off because Windows 98 and FAT32 can handle 128 gigs, and I'd like to get as much space as possible. Cue the build montage. The unique design of this case makes the build order different from any computer I've worked on in the past. I like the design overall. It makes everything easy to access once everything's unplugged and you can take it apart. I think the biggest drawback is the lack of power connectors. Since HP put a standard motherboard in this case, it can go into any regular ATX case and you can use a standard power supply. So there are options if you need to upgrade it in the future and use something different. I just don't think that'll be necessary. During this build, I actually did install the modem, but I did remove it. I had some issues and had to do some troubleshooting off camera, and one of the things to go was that modem. Like I mentioned earlier, I didn't use it in the rebuild. I'll cover those details a bit later. One of my favorite features of this case is the motherboard tray. I've worked on a lot of old cases and I've used motherboard trays. I actually miss that as one of my favorite features that has disappeared. Now that this build is complete, I'd like to get it set up and powered on so we can see it in action. Off camera, I used the factory restore disk to set up Windows 98 so we can actually see the computer boot into Windows for the first time since it's been rebuilt. Now that the first post is complete, it's possible to see what the computer has recognized inside Windows. The first thing to note is that we're running Windows 98 2nd Edition, and the computer shows 63 megabytes of RAM available. 1 meg is reserved for the onboard video. The OEM branding was also all applied by the restore disk, so it appears that all of the restore disk steps were successful. The only thing that didn't work is the network card that I added and the USB storage as expected. I need to install the network drivers, and then once I can access the network, I can access my USB storage drivers to resolve those two hardware issues. After fixing network access and USB storage, I began to set up video games. I noticed immediately that I was having problems with the sound. This is a problem if you want to use a computer for DOS games because DOS generates sounds different than Windows. And in this particular case, this computer can't handle DOS sounds correctly. Listen to how Warcraft 2 sounds with this particular onboard audio chip. Ignore that clicking, that's a microphone issue, not a Warcraft issue. In order to fix the audio distortion, I decided to use some different hardware. The modem was removed at this point to give me PCI space. I only have 3 PCI slots, so I needed to remove that card to be able to accommodate the hardware that I need to put in this machine. I have two Creative Labs Sound Blaster PCI cards with the original software. I'm going to use one of these in place of the onboard sound. Next, I'm going to install the VisionTech Radeon R7000. That will give me access to some Windows 3D games that the onboard graphics can't support. Please note that this motherboard doesn't have an AGP slot. That is why I'm using the PCI version of the Radeon R7000. Please don't forget that I'm reinstalling the network card to make sure that this machine retains its network connectivity. The loss of the modem at this point isn't a big deal for this machine and this machine's intended purpose. With the new hardware installed, a couple of BIOS changes are necessary. After entering the BIOS, move to the Advanced menu and set the primary video adapter to PCI. Without this change, this particular system will not allow you to use the R7000. There is also going to be another issue we have to address inside of Windows. Next, while still on the Advanced tab, navigate to the I/O device configuration and set the AC97 audio device to disabled, so there won't be any audio conflicts once we get into Windows and DOS. Now that all of the hardware changes are complete, I want to jump back into Device Manager and make sure everything's working. In the BIOS, I mentioned there was a Windows issue that had to be resolved, and that is that the Intel software has to be disabled, or the VisionTech Radeon R7000 software will not install, and I even got a video blue screen of death a couple of times. The network card is actually still recognized, so moving that around didn't affect anything. And then finally, need to check out the sound devices. You can see the Sound Blaster Audio PCI and the Legacy device. The Legacy device gives us the application settings that we're going to need for DOS to make sure our DOS games can access the PCI sound card. The important thing to note here is the Sound Blaster 16 emulation settings, IRQ DMA, and the MPU 401. The games that I have don't take advantage of the ad-lib settings. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back into the Warcraft 2 setup so that I can change the audio settings.
Your sound card works perfectly.
I'm just using the auto set and test functions. One thing you'll notice when the music setup is complete, that the music may sound off, and that's because the Sound Blaster PCI, it actually uses the new Creative CQM sound reproduction instead of the original Yamaha, and that's where the sort of distorted sound comes from. I'm going to start a new game of Warcraft 2. You can hear that the music effects are still different than what was intended by the developers, but the sound effects for voices and in-game digital sound have all been fixed, and the game should be playable.
The Horde is preparing to launch an assault against the mainland of Lordaeron. Orgrim Doomhammer, war chief of the Orcish hordes and ruler of the Black Rock.
Now that I've exited the game, I'm going to play a couple sample sounds from the Windows Media Library, and you can hear that the MIDI reproduction is accurate for Windows. This is a great example of DOS and Windows producing sound in different ways. Thank you everyone for watching this video. I hope you found it fun. I found this computer at an auction for $1, and I'm going to say it was a great value. And to play Windows 98 games, which I have a whole bunch of old games that are on CD-ROM, which are perfect for this machine, it's not going to be the best game PC for DOS. The sound issues that I have are going to make it so I'll probably only play Windows games. With that Radeon 7000 and DirectX 9C, it should work fine for most Windows games that I already have. And I might even be able to track down a few on the internet or from good old games that I can play natively on this system. I'm going to look for an Ensoniq Soundscape card, probably a 1370 or a 1371. They still have DOS support and may be able to reproduce sound better, making this a good DOS machine as well. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you didn't like this video, give me a thumbs down and tell me why in the comments. Since this is my first video, I'd really like to try and adjust my style based on user feedback and what I find works and what doesn't work. And I thank you all very much for your time. Have a great day.